Great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this morning. I can see the numbers beginning to creep up, but I think let's kick off because we've got a lot to crack through and want to make good use of everybody's time this morning. So firstly, to say a really warm welcome to this webinar hosted by ourselves with Nature Scott, our partners. My name is Kate Turton. I'm the relatively new Deputy Director for the Natural Resources Division in the Scottish Government. So I'll be sort of opening today's session and joined by my team, Lisa, who's going to chair and facilitate some of the sessions as we go through that, Matthew, who will be one of our panelists, and Sue, who's, I'd just like to say huge thanks to, who's been instrumental in pulling this whole event together. So thanks, Sue, very much for all your efforts. Just a few bits and pieces before we start in terms of ensuring we really get the most out of this webinar in terms of etiquette. Please keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking so that we don't get those feedback loops working. Do turn your video cameras on if you're speaking so that we can bring a bit more of a human touch to the proceedings today. And at the end, we'll finish with asking you all to turn your cameras on so we can all see breadth and depth of participation in today's webinar. And then do possibly keep your mobile phones on silent if you're speaking so that you're not interrupted by those phones, just to make things work a bit more smoothly. And then just to remind you all that the webinar will be recorded and recordings will be made available. So, do bear that in mind in terms of your own participation. But hopefully it'll all go smoothly this morning. So firstly, just as I said, just to welcome everybody. And I'm going to open with a few slides just to set the scene, and then I'm going to hand over to Lisa to take us through and kick off the opening session. So if we could just move to the next slide, please, Tim. Fantastic. So I get the easy job in a sense today by just sort of setting the scene so that we all kind of are speaking from the same page, and we're sort of starting with a common understanding. And I'm assuming that the majority of you on this call will know some of this background inside out, but just to highlight the key points there, that we know that global biodiversity and ecosystem health are declining faster than any point in human history. We know, and I think it's been really helpful to have us focused on those 5 key drivers of biodiversity loss: climate change, land use change, intensive agriculture and overfishing, pollution and invasive species. And I think that provides a useful framework for all different countries and different areas, and whichever kind of unit that you're working at, to think through which of those are the real key drivers in the areas where you're working. And from a very unique Scotland perspective, the 2019 State of Nature report concluded there has been no let up in the net loss of nature, and 49% of Scotland's species have decreased in abundance over the past 20 years. So a crisis, I think, and the profile around our biodiversity crisis is growing. I think we are really working towards, certainly as the Scottish Government now, speaking the twin crises language of a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis, and needing to address the two hand in hand. Tim, if you go to the next slide, please. This is a chart which, again, I'm sure you've all seen before, but I think really kind of, for me, illustrates the scale of the challenge ahead of us. So really thinking about how do we accelerate progress to both halting the loss of biodiversity and very quickly starting to bend that curve and start to restore biodiversity and move that curve onto a different trajectory. Lots of conversation, I'm sure, amongst us all about whether this ambition of reversing biodiversity loss by 2030, becoming nature positive by 2030, can be the unifying goal for all of us, the equivalent of our net zero. So that's a really interesting, good conversation that I know we're all talking about, and the Scottish Government's very interested in exploring some of that with you and some of our participants on this call today. I think just to say from the Scotland perspective, from the Scottish Government perspective, the Scottish biodiversity strategy, which we are committed to launching within 18 months of COP15, will really work through these important questions around our ambition, what success looks like in Scotland, and what are the key building blocks in terms of realising that ambition, and including the development of delivery plans to support the strategy, to make sure that the strategy is not just a high-level statement of ambition, but is really backed up in terms of delivery. So that's an important process for us. We see this webinar today as very much a part of that, enabling us to interact with you, begin to kind of generate those ideas that we'll need to take forward. And we'll be coming back to you all and interacting with you all over the next few months in terms of laying out that plan for the development of the strategy, and seeking really to draw in your views, draw in your expertise, and really make this a common endeavour, because the scale of the challenge will be such that we'll only make progress if we really bring in all the different stakeholders from civil society, from business, communities, government and agencies working together. Next slide, please, Tim. So in that, with that huge challenge ahead of us, obviously a unique year in terms of both the climate change COP in Glasgow, but also COP15 scheduled in October too. So one of the things we want to do during this year is build up that momentum, build up a bit of a kind of rhythm, and a real rhythm which sort of starts to build awareness, starts to build engagement of the public, starts to build the engagement of all the different stakeholders, and really seek to use the run into the two COPs in a way that kind of engages and inspires and generates that momentum that we need. So one of the things we will be doing is, and Nature Scott will be doing, is drawing together all of these different events in collaboration with the Royal Botanical Gardens of Edinburgh. We're going to sort of put together an interactive web page which can capture these events, enable you to sort of position your events under one common banner, enable you to draw those synergies and links between these events, again, to really kind of reinforce that momentum and that direction of travel into the COPs at the end of this year. So more details on the road to COP15 and the interactive webpage will come, but we hope to launch that very shortly in the next couple of days. So really looking forward to your engagement. That kind of webpage and that interactive timeline will be as good as everyone on this call can make it. Your participation will be really critical. So just once again to warmly welcome you all. We've got some fantastic people with us today, fantastic panelists, and really looking forward to a really good conversation, drawing together all of our unique perspectives to put some energy behind this collective challenge of addressing the biodiversity loss that we see all around us today. Many thanks, Tim, and I'll hand over to Lisa.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Lisa McCann. I am very newly appointed as Head of Biodiversity within the Scottish Government. So I'm just going to say a few brief words about the Edinburgh Declaration and how we came to be involved in the Edinburgh process, which Sue and John have been working very hard on. And then I'll introduce you to today's panel of speakers, who are a great selection from across our different partnerships. And each of them will explain what they are working on at the moment. And hopefully you'll be able to see, a golden thread connecting through those different levels of engagement, from what we're doing in government to that really important local community level. And obviously inclusivity is really important in delivering and making sure that things work at a local level. And so hopefully some of our speakers will touch on that too. If we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as Kate has said, really not enough progress has been made over the last decade, as we're all aware, in delivering that global strategy for 2011 to 2020 and in delivering upon those IACHI targets. So, Scotland has performed well. It delivered against 9 of these targets, but within Scottish Government, we really recognise that to bend the curve for biodiversity, there really needs to be high ambition, and that has to be set globally, it has to be set nationally, and and it has to be set locally as well. So that's why we were really keen to become involved in the development of the next set of biodiversity targets for 2030, which, as we know, are hopefully going to be agreed upon at the COP15 meeting. So within Scottish Government, we're leading the Edinburgh process of consultation with non-state governments and really driving forward a global plan of action that will help sub-state, regional and local governments implement that new post-2020 framework and those new targets. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So for the last 2.5 years, within Scottish Government, we and our partners have been working with the UN Convention on Biological Diversity to deliver the views of non-state governments, cities and local authorities on the new global strategy for biodiversity. So that's the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, what's unusual for the UN is that this level of government is recognised by the CBD, and it's one of their major stakeholder groups, actually. We had planned to hold a 3-day workshop in April last year, but because of the pandemic, like everything, we moved online. But what we did was delivered 3 global consultations, 8 webinars and 3 reports last year, which I think is really quite impressive. And really importantly, we delivered the Edinburgh Declaration and a renewed plan of action for subnational and local governments. Now, what the Edinburgh Declaration does is asks that those subnational local governments commit to working with all levels of government in providing resources, including finances and capabilities, in order to implement positive actions for biodiversity over the next decade. So, that includes knowledge exchange, sharing best practice like we're doing today. And, this webinar, I think, is a really key part of that. So over 150 governments, cities and local authorities across the world have signed the declaration, and that includes 15 in Scotland, and there's a further 6 organisations who have endorsed it. So I think that's something to be really proud of and really impressive. The renewed plan of action provides a really flexible framework for those subnational local governments to implement the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and to really help their contribution towards their national strategies and action plans that will need to be put in place after COP15, and which Kate alluded to in Scotland. So we really hope the action plan is going to be adopted by the convention at the COP15 meeting, and we're certainly using both of these to influence the drafting of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to ensure that that role for subnational governments is really fully recognised throughout the strategy document. So the aim of the CBD is to adopt a whole of government and whole of society approach for biodiversity. And we're already doing that in Scotland, but we know we could do more. We're certainly looking at how we can achieve that with our new Scottish biodiversity strategy, which, as Kate said, will be published within a year of COP. And so hopefully the panelists will also touch on that and elaborate on that. So if we can move just to the next slide, and I will really quickly introduce you to our panelists. And if you have any questions as we go along, please do pop them into the Q&A box, and we will scoop up all the questions at the end. So I'll start off with Francesca Awaska, who is the Chief Executive of Nature Scot. Francesca joined Nature Scot as CEO in October 2017, and before that she spent over 20 years working in the civil service in a wide range of posts, but initially as an economist. We then have Leonie Alexander, who's from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, and Leonie worked as an ecologist in the private sector for over 20 years before taking up the post of Urban Biodiversity Project Officer at the Royal Botanic Gardens, and she's been involved in the Edinburgh Shoreline Project amongst other things of late. Then we have Julie Dewar, who is from Edinburgh City Council, and Julie is a senior planning officer, and she works on biodiversity and blue and green infrastructure. And she's been a previous chair of the Edinburgh Biodiversity Partnership. We have Paul Walton from SE Link, who is a trustee of the Scottish Environment Link and head of habitats and species at RSPB. And then we have our very own Matthew Bird, who is the biodiversity team leader within Scottish Government, and he's been in the team for around 3 years and has had a career within Scottish Government in many different roles before that. And last but not least, we have Renata Gomez from the Regions for Sustainable Development, and Renata has been working really closely with the Scottish Government on the Edinburgh process and is one of our really valued partners in that. She's the manager of the biodiversity programme at Regions 4, where she leads research projects and coordinates a large scale of work. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Francesca, and I hope you all enjoy the session today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate and Lisa. Particularly thank you to Lisa for highlighting my kind of previous civil service career. Gosh, it sounds so long when you said that, Lisa. I feel very old, but I'll move on from that. But thank you very much for inviting me to take part at this event today, which really, as Lisa and Kate have said, launches Scotland's journey to COP15. If we can maybe just have the first slide of my presentation, Tim. Brilliant, thank you. And as both Lisa and Kate have referenced, Scotland's really led the way in a process which recognises the incredibly important role of subnational government, of cities and local authorities in delivering global and national biodiversity and nature policies and targets. And we'll hear some examples of that later in what I'm about to say, and also great to have colleagues from those organisations who I'm sure will cover that too. We know that in terms of the UK government's constitution, don't worry, I'm not going to get into a big constitutional piece, but biodiversity and nature is devolved. So in Scotland, we are able to set our own ambitions for biodiversity, which reflect Scotland's unique wildlife and culture, whilst contributing to global nature targets, the Aichi targets that we all know and love, and which will be revised at COP15 in October. So we could maybe move on to the next slide. As has already been mentioned, in December last year, the then Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham provided a statement of intent for biodiversity, which set out the biodiversity priorities post 2020. And I mean, the reason for doing this, I'm sure, is very familiar to you all, but because of the delay in COP15, we didn't want there to be any perceived or real gap in the Scottish Government's and Nature Scots ambition for biodiversity, with the Aichi timeline coming to an end in 2020, and then the formulation of new international targets in 2021. And that biodiversity statement of intent committed to the publication of a new Scottish biodiversity strategy within 12 months of COP15, which has already been referenced. And I see there's already been a question in the chat about why it's taking so long. And I'll maybe just address that quickly now. Actually, 12 months to develop what is going to be quite a complex strategy on the back of an international conference, I actually don't think is very long, particularly if we want the engagement with many of you around this virtual table and a range of stakeholders and contacts. And the starting gun, if you like, is the output from COP15. And we don't know what that is yet. What we are doing is obviously putting in place the arrangements, the building blocks. So once that starting gun is fired, we're able to engage, as Kate set out, with all of you to ensure that we're able to formulate an ambitious, realistic strategy with associated delivery plans within a year of the COP. So I hope that kind of goes some way to answering the question, and well done for being quick off the mark in the Q&A box. Just in terms of the overarching framework, then obviously the Scottish Environment Strategy provides that overarching policy framework for the next Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, and it in itself sets the biodiversity agenda for the next decade and beyond. We, as Kate has referenced, it has to be grounded in delivery. So as we develop the strategy, we will be thinking very carefully about delivery, so we can formulate a delivery plan, and we want to engage with you on that. During the development of the strategy and delivery plan, we know that we must ensure that we engage with a range of organisations and individuals to ensure that the strategy that we develop is right for nature, but it's also right for the people of Scotland. We have to reflect the needs and ambitions of all people to ensure that we address the twin challenges of the nature and climate crises in a just way. And I'm sure you'll all have picked up the many references from the new government about a just transition. So that is at the forefront of our mind. Could maybe move on to the next slide. I thought it might be just useful just to reference the importance of how national plans are translated to local delivery. And we know that, you know, many local authorities, and great to see local authority colleagues here today, are already delivering national priorities in a range of different ways across many agendas, including for nature and with the multiple benefits that that delivers. We feel that it's really important that national biodiversity and nature priorities can be reflected and delivered at local level, and we want to work with you to ensure that that is the case. There will be a number of mechanisms that will be particularly helpful to bring this work together. For example, local biodiversity action plans developed by local partners at local authority level have proved a useful mechanism in delivering national priorities. And what we'd really like to see is to ensure the delivery of such plans are embedded across all areas of local authority business and can deliver across the multiple agendas that I mentioned. So that's working for people and communities, working to address climate issues, and working to restore nature through nature-based solutions. Integration with other regional and local planning mechanisms is also critical, and we've got loads of great examples of that across Scotland. If I can maybe move on to the next slide, which gives some specific examples of how national priorities are being delivered through local action. And I think it's really important to note in these examples the importance of benefits to people and communities. So the restoration of sand dunes at St Andrews through fencing, controlled and improved access points, manual litter picking to ensure seaweed debris remains on the beach, have all established, help establish dunes and encouraged plant colonisation, and that in itself has helped deliver coastal restoration. If we move from St Andrews to Glasgow, we have urban regeneration plans involving the Mary Hill Housing Association to provide local nature-based solutions which will link important nature corridors in Glasgow, and providing more space for nature to move through the city, and that ecological connectivity is really vital, as well as ensuring that people are connected to nature in their everyday lives. And then if we move from Glasgow to the borders, we see a great example of river restoration, providing essential habitats for species and improving water quality, whilst protecting people and communities and their properties from the effects of flooding. River restoration, just like nature connectivity, is another national biodiversity priority. Now, local authorities link to many organisations, including Nature Scot, and by doing this can utilise a vast array of skills and leverage to deliver their biodiversity action plans, to deliver both against local priorities, but also national priorities. Now, if we can move on to the next slide, one of the messages I'd just like to give today is that if you're sitting there thinking, this sounds great, I want to kind of get involved, how can I in my organisation do more, then Nature Scot's here to help. There are many experts throughout kind of local authorities already, but Nature Scot and other organisations represented today can support you through developing practice, through case studies and pilots. For example, we're working with Glasgow City Council in a partnership with Google called Tree AI, which will explore innovative ways of using IT to manage and plan street trees and urban forests, and they have the benefit of reducing city heating and also creating more space for nature. We also provide advice, as illustrated in the examples, but also at strategic level through partnerships, open space strategies, and development and master planning. we have money, which many organisations like. So we run a number of funds such as peatland restoration, the Green Infrastructure Fund, the Biodiversity Challenge Fund. So through those sources, we can support you in kind of developing your delivery focus. And we're also working to grow the role of private finance through the developments of codes, practice and offsetting. We're actively engaged in place-based partnerships and developing the nature-based jobs sector as part of the Green Recovery Package. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of how we translate national priorities into local action. Some really great examples of local activity delivering against biodiversity priorities and how we can help. So I'll say thank you for now for this opportunity to speak to you today about this, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the morning. And I am handing over now to Leonie Alexander from RBGE. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. So I'm going to be, I'm a research associate at the Royal Botanic Garden, and I'm going to give you a few examples, as Francesca has referred to, about sort of national biodiversity planning down to the local level. So a few examples of working with communities and local businesses in the Edinburgh context. So my post was really the Botanic's contribution to Edinburgh Living Landscape, which is a big overarching strategy for Edinburgh in terms of biodiversity management and environmental management. And there are a number of partners: the City of Edinburgh Council, Botanic Gardeners, the Botanic Gardens signed up, University of Edinburgh, and their role was really about having a large estate where they actually had the power to make a difference within the city boundary. And also their work on UK pollinators. They were part of a big UK research project on pollinators, which was quite sort of instrumental in determining management strategies within the local council area in Edinburgh. So first slide, please, Tim, thank you. The first example I'm going to give you is working with local business. Some of you might recognize this. This is the Fingal. It's a kind of floating boutique hotel in Leith Docks. When I started my job, I was sort of opportunity mapping, trying to find a good area to work in. North Edinburgh offered lots of potential and need. So there's a lot of post-industrial dereliction and sort of poor function in terms of access to the coast. And there's also high multiple deprivation areas. So I focused a lot of my effort on that during my work as Urban Biodiversity Officer. And this project was a collaboration with the Water of Leith Conservation Trust, who do great work down the Water of Leith. That's the river valley that runs straight through Edinburgh from the Pentland Hills all the way to Leith Docks. So what we did here was the Fingal had a really sort of scrubby bit of grassland that didn't have any particular function. Their guests standing on the deck can look out on this area, and we made contact and decided that actually we could create something visually appealing which would benefit biodiversity. Leith is one of the areas in Edinburgh with the least green space. So any opportunity is worth taking. So working with Water of Leith Conservation Trust and volunteers, we created this meadow, and I have to say that it's the client, as it were. So the Fingal is run by a charity which also runs the Royal Yacht Britannia, and they're delighted because it's a big splash of colour. They get enormous positive feedback from neighbours. And it's clearly beneficial for invertebrates particularly. So next slide, please. Tim, thank you. Here are some of the volunteers working on it. It actually takes, you have to recognize, it takes quite a lot of effort to sort of mobilize these projects. It's a very small bit of land, but it does take a lot of effort and coordination. But the results are there, and it's definitely worth all that effort. And next slide, Tim, thank you. So the Royal Yacht Britannia and the Fingal, we also did planting up with wildflowers at Royal Yacht Britannia, and they treated all the volunteers to coffee and scones, which went down extremely well. Next slide, thank you. This is an example. This is at Seafield. Some of you might recognize it. A volunteer, Emily, who's in the middle there, she got in touch to say she cycles from Portobello every day into the city of Edinburgh, and she hates this bit because it just looks so neglected and it could be so much better. So she was asking, you know, what could they do as local volunteers? So we went out to have a look, and actually, if you look closely, there's quite a high diversity of species on that bank. So we decided we would augment, and we supplied plants for this local group from Seafield and Portobello. We worked with the local companies that sort of back onto this area, and we planted a load of shrubs and climbers to improve the kind of structural diversity of this area. So big effort with lots of local volunteers. And the key message there really is that although you get you know, some local communities that know exactly what they want to do, many local communities want to do something, but they don't know what the best thing to do is. And they don't know where to source plant material, they don't know which species to, you know, to initiate. So having a resource, somebody you can call on to say, could you come and give some advice, and can you suggest suppliers, and where's the best place to get Scottish seed? All those things are really important. Next slide, please. So we initiated a wildflower nursery at the Granton Hub, and this was hugely beneficial just in terms of, if you look at the next slide, you can see the hub on a sort of community event day. So this is in an area where there isn't really a kind of common space for people to come together. It's the old electric car factory from the late 1800s, and this was their office space. So a local group took that over, and we started managing what was an area that was just surrounded by Harris fencing and nobody could get in, and covered in buddleia. So a huge amount of work went on here. This is where the wildflower nursery is. And the benefit of the wildflower nursery is you can grow species that, you know, are suited to site and locality. We had 2 events every year selling wildflowers for the public. So you get a chance for engagement, chit chat about, you know, what I should put where. And also latterly, over the last 2 years, we actually grew to order. So we grew for Butterfly Conservation Scotland, and we also grew for a project which was funded by Biodiversity Challenge Fund in Edinburgh. So it's a chance to generate some resources for a local community group. You couldn't make a commercial venture out of it, but because there's sort of public funding coming in, then the plant sales actually do generate revenue for this charity, Granton Hub. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is kids. Well, I mean, we all know these are the decision makers in the future, and it's just so critical that they have an emotional connection with nature. Without that emotional connection, I think they will not make the right decisions in the future. So this again is on the seafront at Newhaven. It's quite a sort of bleak bit of the coast. And we worked in partnership with the David Lloyd Centre, who managed this area just by cutting the grass on a regular basis. So local volunteers wanted to do something here. So we initiated this and worked to get trees. We grew on wildflowers at the Granton Hub. We got the kids involved, primary and secondary, from the local schools, and have created something that will be different in the future and demonstrates that principle of habitats like coastal scrub, which are so important. Next slide. Also working with, this was particularly with businesses, you can actually do some serious conservation work. So there's a butterfly which lives on Arthur Seat, and that's where the type specimen was identified. It feeds on rock rose, which is the plant on the left, in the left planter. And this is the head office of Glenmorangie Whisky. So we launched a square meter for butterflies, which was a project to try and entice businesses to get involved. Glenmorangie were very happy to get involved, and in fact did a major launch event for us. So they had a very literal interpretation of the square meter for butterflies. So we had 3 caterpillar food plants, rock rose for northern brown argus, sheep sorrel for small coppers, and on the right you can see lotus birdsfoot trefoil for common blue butterflies. And the idea was to create sort of stepping stones from Arthur's Seat. You can see Cotton Hill in the back, so this is pretty close to Arthur's Seat. And Butterfly Conservation will be monitoring the results of this. So we have a whole suite of sites within Edinburgh now, working with local businesses. And under Biodiversity Challenge Fund, there's a whole series of stepping stone square meters have been created right up to the south to Little France. So it's a great, communities love this because it gives them a real sense of purpose. And it means that you can do some sort of, work with a kind of serious intent to it. Next slide, please. And that was the launch. That on the bottom left is the northern brown argus butterfly that we're targeting. Next slide. So this is down to the coast now, to the intertidal, working with a number of partners, including Glasgow University, Edinburgh University, and Concrete in the Classroom, which is about technology for kids, so that non-academic kids can get some practical skills in concrete, actually. So the idea here was, this was funded by Natural Environmental Research Council, and this is a really important thing. So I was talking about, having a facility, so somebody you can call up if you're a member of the community and say, we'd like to do something, I'm not quite sure what, so you can offer advice. And here, this is an example of a collaboration, bringing lots of organizations together and making stuff happen. So this was a demo project. It was about a public engagement project that NERC were funding. On the left, you can see a bolt-on rock pool, and this just demonstrates the principle of trapping some intertidal water. So where you have vertical sea defences, you have no intertidal. So this just demonstrates the principle, and people walk along. This is across the walkway to Cramond Island. There are 2 bolted on. And although it's a very small volume of intertidal water, it still does demonstrate the principle. You can go and look in them, and you see crabs and sea anemones and seaweed and so on. And this was designed, we were also interested in concrete sort of innovative design. This was cast into bubble wrap, so you get an enormously complex surface, and that allows for things to colonize and thrive. So it does create a sort of meaningful habitat. And on the right, you can see a series of tiles, and these were to demonstrate that if you have to have sea defences, it's a kind of last resort, really, because you want a natural shoreline. But if you have to have sea defences, then you can create surfaces which allow marine organisms to colonize, which maybe trap a bit of intertidal water for invertebrates. And the ones near the bottom have a very sort of fine pattern on them, which is specifically designed for barnacles. If you get these tiles out on the intertidal in the early part of the year, the barnacle larvae, which are pelagic, floating around, and then they settle. And actually, by the end of the year, you can have a complete barnacle skin, which protects the concrete behind from, storm events, and also from ingress of chloride ions, which can affect metal reinforcement behind. So it's a good story. It's a good engineering story as much as it is a good biodiversity story. Next slide, please. So as we went through the shoreline project, so part of Edinburgh Living Landscape, because of this focus on the north part of Edinburgh, we developed a whole Edinburgh shoreline project which had a more specific focus. And we co-worked with local communities to design a really major exhibition at the Botanics. And that was really to present essentially the environmental and cultural history of this stretch of the Firth of Forth, and to make people aware of, the sort of change over time, shifting baselines, all these really important principles, and to allow people to celebrate what was left and to contemplate, well, what we're going to do about the future. So this is a painting by Burnett, Scottish painting, and it's an oyster house. This is, the oysters were such a major thing in Leith and North Edinburgh, in fact, all around this part of the coast, and an area the size of Wales within the North Sea that's essentially disappeared due to overfishing, pollution, damage from dredging, all these, pressures that are on the seabed. So this story about oysters emerged because effectively they're extinct in Firth of Forth. And if we could have the next slide. And that's what we're talking about, a reef, an oyster reef. So this is the oyster that would have been in Firth of Forth. You can see all those organisms that are associated with it. This is really rich habitats, sponges, seaweeds. There's a shore crab there. There's a sea urchin, all sorts of epiphytic organisms. So they are a fantastic habitat. They're also, of course, filtering something like 200 litres a day. So they're cleaning up the water column, which is an essential function. So they're a keystone species in systems like the Firth of Forth, and they're all gone. So, what are we going to do about that? On the next slide. So this is another really depressing story for you. This is seagrass, Ostra marina, and seagrass meadows. They're just like meadows. These are higher plants that have evolved on land and then come back into a marine environment. So they have very special adaptations to that. This creates, a meadow environment under the sea, which is quite wondrous, really. And what you find is that a lot of key species that are of interest to humans for sustainable management, fish species, the young fish use these, seahorses further south use these habitats because they offer shelter and protection and cover. And there are all sorts of organisms associated with these. So there's been a massive loss of seagrass meadows all around the UK coast. And because of the project, the Shoreline project, we recognise that actually we need to go big scale. So we're now developing a project for reinstatement of seagrass and oysters in the Firth of Forth, and looking for sites where multi-species restoration could be done, because of course the oysters and the seagrass essentially have a really positive coexistence, where the oysters are filtering the water, clearing the water column, and allowing the seagrass to grow to greater depth. Next slide, please. So I was talking about local communities. This is down at Wardy, and I get lots of feedback from people who just get so distressed about, grass being cut when it doesn't need to be cut, contractors coming along and cutting off cowslips when they're just looking so beautiful. This is another example where actually you could just allow this to go and create a beautiful coastal meadow. There are some areas, but there could be bigger areas. So it's that point about, community empowerment in publicly owned areas like this, and also in privately owned areas where people have a sense of ownership because it's their neighborhood. They don't have any power to determine, what management is going to be done. Next slide, please. And now a bit of international flavor from the Botanics. So this is a project, I haven't been involved in this, but a colleague has been working for a long time in Tanzania. And this is community-based forest management, and just how you go through this learning process of what needs to be done for fairness and equity and biodiversity benefit. So essentially, land in Tanzania is publicly owned, but the communities manage it, sometimes completely unsustainably, clear fell, that kind of thing. And of course, they can be evicted at any point, so they don't have any empowerment. And then about 20 years ago, the government instigated a system where communities could express interest in a piece of land and take it over. And the Botanics have been working with other organisations as part of the Darwin Initiative, hugely important source of funding, in order to ensure sustainable management, but also fairness and equity in terms of who benefits. So they found that, of course, it's the middle classes that benefit. So they went through all sorts of interventions to ensure that people who didn't have education actually understood the accounts and were able to contribute and generate benefits for all. And also, of course, there are gender issues. So a lot of work was done to empower local women and to just facilitate that they could, speak up at meetings. Very simple things, but they make such a huge difference to people's lives. So I think that's all from me. Thank you very much. Next slide. Thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing other presentations. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Leonie and Francesca. So my name's Julie Dewar. I work for City of Edinburgh Council and have been involved in planning there for over 20 years in relation to biodiversity. So next slide, please. So yes, just to show off our nice new logo, Edinburgh Biodiversity 2020. We should have had a celebration last year, but hopefully we'll be able to do something this year. Next slide, please. So just to set in context, Leonie and Francesca have given the overview. Leonie, thank you for showing how much lovely work's going on in Edinburgh. What I want to talk about is how we look at delivering that from the local authority point of view. So the framework in which we work is, if you could maybe go back, thank you. So we have the Habitats Directive, the Water Framework Directive, lots of national legislation, but really importantly, we have the biodiversity duty, and that's something that has given us as local authorities a real push to say what we're doing. And as I work in planning, I'll talk a little bit about planning and how that all connects down into the local biodiversity action planning, which I think all follows on well from what Francesca was saying. Next slide, please. So we have this duty to deliver biodiversity, and one of those ways of doing it is through our biodiversity action plan. We've always looked to the Scottish route map to see how that can work, but I would say that going forward it'd be good to have more bottom-up involvement in delivering the next plan. We also look at geodiversity. We forget sometimes that geodiversity and soil is a really important part of biodiversity. So we ensure that we look to the Scottish Geodiversity Charter, and we make sure that we report on our duty every 3 years to keep the connection with biodiversity across the council and not just in planning and parks and gardens, which some people might think that much more wider delivery. Next slide, please. So as I say, we have had a biodiversity action plan in Edinburgh for 21 years. All of that background, all that different legislation and different strategies we use to develop that plan with all our partners. It's very much a partnership-led project. It's not just the local authority. Royal Botanic Gardens are the current chair. We have Nature Scot and many, many other agencies on that. And regardless of the required to report on a 3-year basis, we also do annual reporting, again, to make sure that we show what we're doing and how we're keeping up with our targets. Next slide, please. Across Edinburgh Council, we have many strategies. We've got the new climate strategy, which is currently out for consultation. We've just developed a water vision strategy, great opportunities looking how we manage our water in the city and use that as an opportunity to improve biodiversity. We have our climate adaptation plan, and we also have our open space strategy. So all these different policies and strategies we use to direct the work we do. Next slide, please. So as a local authority, as I say, we have planning, we have local plan policy, open space. We now have a requirement to produce a trees and woodland strategy. I sit on a group with other local authority people like myself across the Lothians and borders, and we think and work together about how we might do that. So it's got a more cross-border approach, not just looking at our local authority. We also have active travel plans, which are a great way of getting people from A to B, but also helping them do that through experiencing nature en route by making those routes more green, more biodiverse. In our Parks and Green Spaces department, obviously we look at designating sites, local nature reserves, greening the grey, all of that sort of thing, making it much more biodiverse and rich. And also our education departments look at how they can look at managing education land in a much more biodiverse way as well, and engaging people in that. And community engagement, as I say, the Biodiversity Partnership is very much a partnership, but we also across the city have many friends groups to engage people into biodiversity. Next slide, please. So from the planning point of view, some of you will be familiar with this, others not. Scottish planning policy requires us to look at nature, sites, the water environment, soils, as I've mentioned, trees, and also seeks to have positive benefits for biodiversity through development. We do have policies in our local plan looking at how we can do that, and obviously moving on into MPF4, that is hopefully going to be a stronger policy. Some of us are working with Scottish Government on developing policies for positive effects for biodiversity, and that's a really positive move. And there's also talk and discussions about how biodiversity action plans can play more of a role in that. And also the overall, as we've all known from the pandemic, the real importance of health and well-being, and how we as local authorities and partners can ensure that biodiversity forms part of that agenda, both from an access point of view and just to experience nature. And as was mentioned, green and blue infrastructure, looking at how we can develop policies and work and actual delivery on the ground for green and blue infrastructure. Next slide, please. So we have our local plan, we have our policies, but it's very important that we also have guidance to explain how we want that delivered. And our local biodiversity action plan is mentioned both in the policy context, but also in the design guidance, and how that can be translated into real delivery on the ground through the master planning, but also through the small features that we may have in the built environment and the natural environment. Next slide, please. So our current biodiversity action plan, which is due for review this year, very much focuses on partnership working, and we have themes running through the action plan, which are green and blue networks, geodiversity, the built environment, species, and monitoring. So from a land management point of view, that's fine. Next slide, please. From the land management point of view, as we've seen from some of Leonie's examples as well, changes in management, very common now for local authorities to be looking at how they can manage their land differently, bee lines, increase for pollinators, etc. Also, growing food is very important for people and health, but also incredibly rich for biodiversity, has been demonstrated. So looking to develop our allotments, and also where we have wetlands that we can improve for biodiversity and give people access to, we look at remanaging those. Next slide, please. Community engagement, as I've said, so the first photograph is when we launched our last biodiversity action plan. The partnership had a sort of celebration day at the Botanics, looking at grassland management there and learning and training and developing so that we can all understand how we can do these things better. The other photograph is of Little France Park, active travel. So that's a local nature reserve, plus active travel through it to get people to it and through it, and that links to our neighbours in Mid Lothian Council. So again, that cross local authority working. And finally, the sort of everyday biodiversity that we're more familiar with, that getting down and dirty, cleaning up the Water of Leith. The Water of Leith Conservation Trust are a strong member of our partnership, and they have spent 30 years improving the Water of Leith and done amazing work to improve that. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, green and blue infrastructure, that lovely wildflower picture is our headquarters. Sadly, I've got no idea what it looks like this year, but hopefully someone's been there taking some photos. And we've worked with butterfly conservation as well to do monitoring there, and SUD schemes, very much tying in with our water strategy. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, species, putting artificial features for species in decline, such as the swift, working with the RSPB, but also working with the Wildlife Information Centre. Very important to continue to resource that data management so we can know where's the best place. Working with Historic Environment Scotland, reintroducing species such as the maiden pink at Holyrood Park, and also the butterflies that come with that. Next slide, please. And finally, as has been mentioned elsewhere, it's really important we monitor what's happening. If we don't monitor, how do we know whether we're being effective? So working with international, that's a working party in Singapore, looking at the Singapore Index, something that we have applied in Edinburgh and will continue to apply with the new guidance, but we will also look at other indicators. ICUN is developing one, and we'll work with those, and we'll work nationally as well, so that we can actually have good data to show how we are making this progress that we're also keen to see. And thanks very much. Next speaker is Paul Walton.
Thanks very much, Julie, and all the previous speakers. Can we just move on to the first slide, please? Okay, so I'm here representing Scottish Environment Link, which is an umbrella organisation for NGOs in Scotland that I'm going to talk about in a little while. But I just wanted to say how pleased I was to hear Kate Turton talking about the language of twin crises, the crisis for biodiversity, the ecological emergency, as being essentially inextricably linked with the climate crisis, bending the curve, nature positive. These are exactly the kinds of sort of frames within which the voluntary sector is increasingly beginning to see the situation that we collectively find ourselves in. Can I have the next slide, please? So Scottish Environment Link, who are we? So we are an umbrella organisation for 41 member organisations, and broadly speaking, these are environmental, non-governmental organisations. And I do sometimes think in Scotland that the role of NGOs in environmental action in its broadest sense is sometimes seen as slightly separate from government. But I just want to highlight, I mean, some of today's speakers, Leonie's wonderful examples of local action, I mean, done under the auspices of Edinburgh's Living Landscape, an initiative where the pivotal role of Link member of the Scottish Wildlife Trust in getting the whole thing going, really, we should all acknowledge. But the wonderful thing is that it's now moving out across sectors and being shared much more widely and precipitating some incredible action on the ground. So it's a broad spectrum of environmental action we're involved with. The combined membership of Link members is well over 500,000 people. And these are people who actually, you know, from RSPB members who pay £40 a year, they care that much to actually pay my wages to come and be here today. But of course, we actually reach out to far more people than that. We have targeted environmental advocacy. We have wide-ranging communications, youth education, people engagement, and outreach programs across the network. And we are engaging with people on a daily basis. And that involves putting concerned individuals in touch with decision makers, policy makers and politicians. It involves some new and innovative initiatives, such as in Shetland, my RSPB colleagues are working with GPs in the NHS to actually prescribe contact with nature for people for whom it will give a direct benefit to their well-being. And it comes right down sometimes to quite small levels. So the bottom picture there is just one of the most rewarding days that I've had in my job in recent years, which is where I did some work with the Glasgow charity Refugee, and we just did wildlife walks along the Kelvin with the refugee population in Glasgow, and had some extraordinary experiences. I remember walking along beside one guy explaining the ecology of the river to him, and he turned to me and says, actually, I was an ecologist at Damascus University. So it was a real eye-opener. So next slide, please. Okay, so engage with people a lot. The NGO sector does a lot more than this. Kate, again, I was really pleased, touched on the State of Nature report. This is a report that is actually a partnership that was originated in the NGO sector, but now includes over 63 different organizations, and that's taxon specialist NGOs, broad conservation NGOs, learned societies. But the last one, 2019, which is the third of this 3-yearly report, we got Nature Scott signed on to that as well. So this becomes a shared evidence base. And I think that is so important. I think the message of my talk is going to be, yes, a lot of things originate in government. Yes, a lot of things originate in the NGO sector. But the key is when we come together, we're more than the sum of our parts. So if we just go to the next slide, please. And of course, as Kate indicated, this report shows the abundance of Scottish species on average has declined, is declining on our watch. But look at that bottom axis there, it only goes to 1994. In ecological terms, that isn't even a blink of an eye. So what we're looking at now is current trends, and that's what the State of Nature tells us, but it's not the whole story because it doesn't capture the historic impacts that people have had on ecosystems in Scotland. Next slide, please. So this is a piece of work that was led by the Natural History Museum down in Kensington, which RSPB had a bit of a supporting role in, but this is called the Biodiversity Intactness Index. And essentially what this does is it looks at a place and looks at the nature that's in it, the species that are there, and then looks at a comparable place elsewhere where human impacts are absolutely at the minimum, and compares the two and uses computer algorithms to figure out, to get an estimate of what biodiversity intactness actually is in that country. And it allows two things. It allows a comparison between different countries and regions around the world. And this graph shows that. And the arrows are, the brown arrow is England, the grey arrow is Northern Ireland, the red arrow is Wales, and the blue arrow is Scotland. When compared to 240 countries around the world, Scotland is 28th from the bottom using this index of biodiversity intactness. And the UK, we are relatively, nature is more intact here than elsewhere in the UK, which is fantastic news. But I do think that this, sometimes you hear this notion in Scotland that, well, you know, we've just got so much nature here, and we do, that the kind of isn't a problem. We don't really need to invest that much in biodiversity conservation. I think this analysis is quite interesting. But what it also does, of course, is it indirectly captures those historic impacts that human beings have had on ecosystems in this country, which I think is quite useful of that. It is just one indicator. It has caveats attached to it, but it is now adopted by the CBD and by IPBES and by the UK Treasury Dasgupta report as well. So it's increasingly recognised as an international standard. And I think it's a bit, it gives a perspective that we haven't really had in Scotland previously, which I think is quite useful. And if people are interested in more detail, there's a fantastic SPICE blog briefing that they've produced about this Biodiversity Intactness Index, which gives some more detail. Next slide, please. Okay, so one thing that hasn't been mentioned so far is the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, which we are now in. And I was very interested in the comments that were made about the timing of the next CBD. I mean, if it is delayed till really 2023 before something concrete really comes forward, we're a third of the way almost towards 2030. So how are we going? And I do think that I think the NGO's view would be that if the Scottish Government really wants to lead, then we really have to start moving now. And I look forward to what Matthew has to say about that. He's indicated that is underway. I have to say there has been limited engagement with NGOs on the strategic development of the Scottish biodiversity strategy so far, but the offer remains there, and we really look forward to strategic engagement with that, but also on its delivery plan. And the next slide, please. Where are we on ecosystem restoration? How do we start in Scotland? Well, actually in Scotland, we don't have to make a start because we've already started. And of course, the fantastic work that's going on in peatlands, historically, this began with a battle between environmental NGOs and the UK government through the 1980s. when fiscal incentives were being given for forestry across the internationally important peatlands of Caithness and Sutherland in the Flow Country. That battle lasted for years, but ended up in a U-turn decision on those fiscal incentives. It ended up in the designation of these peatlands, and then a long-term cross-decadal program of restoration, which has now restored thousands of hectares of this habitat. Again, sort of initially led by NGOs, but now I'm delighted to say, expanded across the country, and increasingly, sort of adequately funded peatland action programme and the peatland code, with Nature Scot and the Scottish Government playing a really lead role. So again, it's kind of NGOs and government kind of coming together in a synergy that really works. Now, 80% of our peatlands remain degraded. It is probably our most important habitat in terms of carbon sequestration. And we have unique biodiversity communities as well. There's a long way to go, but I think this is a fantastic model for other ecosystems and other habitats. And the next slide, please. And I think another example of this kind of cross-sectoral working is the Cairngorms Connect project up in the Cairngorms. Incredibly ambitious, the biggest habitat restoration programme in the UK by some way. It's 600 square kilometres, where there's a 200-year vision for habitat restoration, forest restoration, but also peatland restoration, but also as a key element, engagement with communities of place and communities of interest to deliver a really sustained ecosystem restoration effort across more than just a landscape. It is a proper an ecotope, really, which I think is incredibly exciting. And I actually, when I showed this, I've sort of phoned my colleagues who work on this and said, well, can we say this originated in the NGO sector? And the answer was no, we can't really. This actually originated by people actually working together, and that includes private landowners, it includes Forest and Land Scotland, and Nature Scot and NGOs coming together to develop a shared vision within the Cairngorms National Park. So I really think this is a great example of the kind of collective action that we need to take, and why it's really important that we work cross-sectorally. By that I mean government and the voluntary sector, and indeed the academic sector, and communities, to make these things work properly. So the next slide, please. So yeah, I'm showing the Biodiversity Intactness Index. Does that mean the NGOs are saying we don't have anything worth saving in Scotland? Of course not. We have so much still to lose. The State of Nature report tells us on average we are losing it on our watch, but we have our salmon, we have our heather moorlands, we have our incredible Celtic rainforest, we have our kelp beds, and we have, of course, globally important populations of seabirds. This mysterious and beautiful creature, the Manx shearwater. It's reckoned that Scotland has 40% of the global population of this seabird, but that population is severely threatened. 13 colonies have been lost over about the past century and a half, and that's largely through invasive predators on islands. To really do the job for Scottish seabirds, to build their resilience to climate challenges they face, we need an ecosystem restoration programme across seabird islands, and we can do it with the political will and with the proper investment. Next slide, please. So as we know, the First Minister 2019 told us and acknowledged that the challenges facing biodiversity are as important as the challenge of climate change, and that Scotland can lead the way in the response. I think the Edinburgh Declaration is a fantastic example of political leadership from Scotland. I think we need to come together cross-sectorally and really take ecosystem restoration seriously. Let's remember the 30 by 30 commitment we have at the moment is just protection of what we have in 30% of our land area. That excludes, let's remember, 70%. But in fact, the European Parliament very recently passed by a huge majority, actually, that a 30% target should be about restoration. This is nature restoration targets, which I think is a very important difference and something we need to look at carefully in Scotland. And I think in order to do that, next slide, please. I think it would be worth officials, agencies, politicians looking seriously at Scottish Environment Link's Fight for Scotland's Nature campaign at the moment, the core part of which, where we don't seem to be making progress on, is that we need to set legally binding targets for nature's recovery. as indeed is happening in the European Union at the moment. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. That's really inspiring stuff, and I would like to stress that we are keenly aware, as our Nature Scot, that the NGO sector and communities and local authorities are all absolutely crucial partners in how we address this, and we will be taking your views into account and engaging with you actively as we progress the strategy development. Next slide, please, Tim. I'll try and rattle through these early ones quite quickly. They're sort of providing a bit of strategic context. And I think we've covered some of this already. This is essentially showing that we have only 18 months now to deliver a new biodiversity strategy. So the clocks are ticking. Next slide, please, Tim. Again, most of you will have seen this curve, a slightly different one from the one Kate used earlier, but essentially showing the same thing, which is that enhanced conservation and restoration of ecosystems alone cannot deliver the changes we need to see. So it's a variety of actions which will reduce the rate of decline in biodiversity, and only the full portfolio of these actions in combination can halt and reverse that decline. But the question is, what does that mean in practice for Scotland? What are the steps that we need to take here to deliver that change? Next slide, please, Tim. So there's an abundance of evidence. Again, people will have seen these pictures already today. And they show that we are working together across the sector to gather the evidence we have and to present it in the most agreed way that we can. And it demonstrates really that our efforts so far have not been quite enough. We have a lot of data, and much of it makes for pretty discouraging reading, albeit with some notable highlights, as others have pointed out. Next slide, please, Tim. So what have we been doing to get us into this situation? There's been a fair bit of legislation during the last 50 years or so, although not that much of late. I think, Tim, yeah, that's the one. We can just trundle through this fairly quickly. And next slide. And that legislation is accompanied by a pretty extensive suite of protected areas. These are, as Paul stated, they're really important havens for nature. But the question we need to think about is, are they enough? And are they doing the right job? We've already committed to increase protected areas to 30% of our land. And how do we go about doing that? Next slide, please, Tim. We're spending quite a lot of money, mainly through Scotland's Rural Development Programme. So is more money the answer, or do we just need to think about the way we spend it to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for? Next slide, please. So what are we doing? We've established a biodiversity programme, which is co-led with Nature Scot, and that aims to enable the transformative change that is needed to address the drivers of biodiversity loss and to improve the state of nature in Scotland. One of the key commitments alongside the 30 by 30 is to publish a new strategy within 12 months of COP15. And scoping is underway already, and there's a high degree of ministerial ambition. Next slide, please. So back to this slide, 18 months to get from here to there. And we're now in the process of just finalising the process, in fact, of the steps we need to take to get to a new strategy. The way it's looking at the moment is that, first of all, our Scottish Biodiversity Programme Advisory Group is looking at the evidence and helping us to define what success looks like. What does bending the curve of biodiversity loss actually mean in Scotland? What are the enablers of success and the best incentives we can deploy to improve biodiversity? How do we build on what has worked, and do we understand why some things aren't working? What can we stop, if anything, and should we? Second, development of our action plans will need to take into account the outcome of international negotiations, the requirements of new international targets, and the need to align with others, including the EU. However, it's important to stress at this point that that doesn't mean we're not doing anything in the interim. Our existing strategic framework is continuing to deliver, and ministers, as I say, have high ambition and are continuing to announce new elements of policy as we develop them. So in the event that there are further delays, we will still be forging ahead with development of the strategy and delivery plan, and we would hope to be able to adjust those to the outcome of COP15 if required. And finally, third step, we will take a look at our own systems, leadership and frameworks to assess whether they're delivering what we need. We'll need to agree a vision and set the ambition, and we will need to deliver a strategy focused on enabling us to use the key levers available to us, such as communications and engagement, legislation and regulation, and the key incentive structures to ensure investment is well targeted. Together, these steps will enable us to prepare a new strategic framework which enables the delivery of projects and activities on the ground, the sort of like which we've seen today, that will help us to start to bend that curve. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Now it's my turn. I'll try to be brief. Next slide, please. So like Lisa mentioned at the very beginning, I'm here to represent Regions 4, which is a network of subnational governments. We have, among our many objectives, we have one big program on biodiversity, and our main objective is to represent our members and subnational governments as a whole in the convention, in the CBD. And particularly, we do that, next slide, please, by being the coordinators of the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments and Biodiversity. We also launched in 2016 at COP13 the Regions for Biodiversity Learning Platform, which is the operational partner of the Advisory Committee. Next slide, please. The Advisory Committee is particularly important to the international process because it was created thanks to Decision 10/22 of COP10 over 10 years ago in Japan, in that COP. And it's particularly important to the whole process because we at the Edinburgh process partnership and within the declaration, you may recall that one of the call for actions that we are asking to the CBD parties is to renew and build upon this decision, and also to create, along with a new decision, a plan of action specific for subnational governments, cities and local authorities. This, well, the decision back then in 2010, like I said, created the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments and the one on cities, alongside a platform that was dedicated to channel the voice of our constituencies into the CBD. We started coordinating the Advisory Committee in 2017. And what we do is basically we facilitate a dialogue between our members, subnational governments, and the CBD Secretariat and its parties. We've been supporting, as has been mentioned before, the Edinburgh process since the beginning, because we believe that this kind of leadership can only be, and the objectives that we pursue can only be achieved in partnership with leaders such as the Scottish Government and, of course, all of its local authorities. Next slide, please. what we do in Regions 4 is that we create and gather knowledge from subnational governments, and we create reports, information documents, and basically recommendations for the CBD on specific agenda items that are being negotiated as part of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, for example. And we channel these recommendations, and we ask with these recommendations the CBD that consider subnational governments better, and we provide the reasons why they should consider and include a more ambitious space for subnational and local governments within the new framework. One example of how we do this is, next slide please, is the report that we launched at the previous SUBSTA 23, a couple of years ago. As you know, the whole negotiation processes have been delayed due to the pandemic, as we know, and hopefully by sometime soon, hopefully October, the COP will take place and will consider our request. We gather this report, the Mainstreaming Biodiversity, the Subnational Government Experience Report, with the aims of informing the subsidiary body on implementation, on informing its decisions on this specific issue, on the issue of mainstreaming biodiversity. And yes, we provide information and recommendations on these 4 specific themes: capacity building, partnerships, mechanisms to monitor the implementation of the mainstreaming practice in itself. And we highlighted the obstacles that block mainstreaming of biodiversity in our level of government. The interesting thing about working with international networks or the advisory committee in this case is that we gather knowledge and expertise from all over the world, and we try to speak as one voice, and we provide the reasons why the parties and the CBD Secretariat overall need to listen to us, and we provide we make the case for subnational governments in these specific issues. Next slide, please. For COP15, we are hoping to launch a case study database, and this actually is related to what we've been hearing today, the importance of local actions and the ability of us as networks to showcase these actions so it can be replicated and accessible to other local and subnational governments of the world. The case study database that we are planning to launch will actually touch base on these thematic areas. You may see that some of these are actually included in what we've been sharing today, right? We've been hearing today. So I think it's fundamental to continue to work in this direction, to share these local and subnational experiences, but also be able to replicate them. And perhaps, and most certainly in many parts of the world, they are sharing the same challenges as local governments in Scotland, for example. And knowing your success stories, your challenges, is actually helpful to advance towards the global targets that we're going to need to achieve, right? And together. Next slide, please. Finally, partnerships are fundamental for doing this, like I've been saying. And my recommendations to you, and especially if we want to see the outcomes that we are hoping for COP15, I would recommend that you make your voice heard in the international negotiations and forums by becoming an active part of platforms and networks that represent local and subnational governments in the CBD in particular, to build partnerships with other local governments with similar challenges, even outside your own country or your own geographic area, because no matter how different geographically you may be, I assure you that the challenges are similar all over the world. And certainly to continue to spread the message of the Edinburgh Declaration, we have until COP15 to gather support. So we're strongly aiming for that. In the next slide, you can see my contact information and website if you want to know a little bit more about the international process and how specifically Regions 4 does it, and learn more about our initiatives. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Renata. I'm going to pick up here. We're kind of on the border of our time now. We had hoped to have about 15 or 20 minutes for a Q&A session. But I see that, you know, many people have been putting questions into the Q&A box. There has also been some great discussion and references in the chat box. So we're going to keep the questions, and unfortunately we don't have time to address everything here today. So we're going to post answers to the questions on the web page, along with the recording of the session today. But it's been great to hear from all our panelists. So Tim, I think we could just move to the next slide. Unfortunately, Kate has had to leave us, so I was just going to make some closing remarks. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sue Campbell. I've been working on international biodiversity aspects within Matthew and Lisa's team in the Scottish Government, and working very closely with Renata on the Edinburgh process. As you can see from this cartoon, this has become quite a favourite cartoon of ours, to demonstrate, you know, just the huge challenges that we're facing across the globe with COVID, you know, with recession, with the climate change and biodiversity crisis. And all of what we're talking about today is hugely important for our local communities, but also, you know, globally as well. We've had great presentations from people across Scottish Government, our colleagues in Scottish Government, and Francesca today, setting out the policy landscape. And Francesca really set out in her presentation how NatureScot translate that policy landscape into delivery, particularly at local level actions. And all of the presentations that we had today, from Leonie at the Botanics, from Julie from Edinburgh Council, from Paul, all showed how important local level actions are and what great work is going on locally. Renata also mentioned that, you know, as well as sharing examples and sharing experiences locally and working together locally, it really is important to work together internationally as well. So, you know, sharing lessons learned, showcasing and demonstrating action at local levels is really, really important across all levels. So if that's one takeaway that I take today, it's about positive approaches and partnership working. And that's certainly something that we do want to bring to the new Scottish Biodiversity Strategy and continue building on what we've developed over the past years in our previous biodiversity strategy. So I just want to thank all of the speakers again today, and to thank everyone for their time. Thank all of the participants for joining the webinar today. Just to remind you of the Road to COP15 initiative that Kate mentioned in the in the start of the webinar. You know, that really emphasises the need for partnership working and is a really tangible example of where we can all set out what we're doing in the run up to COP15 and share our experiences. So once we have the information, we'll pass that on to you, and we really encourage you to participate in that Road to COP15 initiative. Yeah, on behalf of the Scottish Government and myself, thanks very much to all of the panellists today for your wonderful talks, and thank you everybody for joining us, and thanks to Tim and NatureScot for hosting the webinar on their platform. We hope to see you soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Sue. Bye.